They deported the mother on her son's 5th birthday. The man who signed the order? He was their father, and he had no idea they existed. While Judith Baker spent 6 years fighting through hell to get back to the American-born twins he'd abandoned, Dustin Tanner built a billion-dollar empire and never once read the names on the deportation forms he signed. Then Albert collapsed. Rare genetic condition. Only one bone marrow match in the entire national database. The billionaire CEO who'd erased their family with his signature. Now Dustin was staring at 2 16-year-old boys with his face, and the mother he'd deported was standing between them with 16 years of rage and one non-negotiable demand. If you want to save your son, you're going to confess what you did to the world. Dustin Tanner saw his own face staring back at him in a hospital hallway. Twice. The 2 teenage boys had his eyes, his dimple, his bone structure, and the woman standing between them looked at him like he was already dead. He'd arrived at County General expecting a routine donor consultation. His assistant had explained it clinically that morning, over coffee. Rare genetic condition, national database match, standard marrow donation protocol. Dustin had agreed immediately. He always did. Philanthropy was good optics, and a 16-year-old boy was dying. Easy decision. But the moment he turned the corner into the pediatric oncology wing and saw the first boy sitting in the waiting area, pale, thin oxygen tube in his nose, but unmistakably, impossibly familiar, Dustin's knees went soft. The boy looked up. Gray-green eyes. The exact shade Dustin saw every morning in the mirror. Left dimple. The one his father had, the one Dustin hated in photographs because it made him look too young for boardrooms. The boy stared at him. Didn't blink. Just studied him, like he was calculating something only he could see. Dustin's hand found the doorframe. His vision tunneled. The fluorescent lights above buzzed too loud. Then he saw the second boy. Standing near the vending machines. Same height, same build, same face. Twins. Identical twins. Both of them carrying Dustin's DNA like a signature he'd forgotten he'd written. The second boy wasn't staring. He was glaring. Arms crossed. Jaw set. The kind of anger that had been aging for years. A nurse walked past, glanced between Dustin and the boys, and stopped mid-step. Her eyes darted back and forth like she was watching a tennis match. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh." Dustin opened his mouth. No sound came out. The doctor appeared from a side office, chart in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose. "Mr. Tanner, thank you for coming. We'll start with some preliminary questions before the—" She looked up, saw Dustin frozen in the doorway, saw the boys, saw the nurse's expression. She tilted her head slightly, the way doctors do when they're trying to make sense of something that doesn't compute. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "I assumed you'd been informed. Given the remarkable genetic match, I thought—" She trailed off, looked at her chart, looked at Dustin, looked at the boys. "Are you their father?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Dustin's throat closed. The first boy, the sick one, the one with the oxygen tube, didn't move, just kept staring at Dustin with those impossible eyes. The second boy made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Something bitter and sharp that made Dustin's stomach turn. And then she walked around the corner. The woman. Older than he remembered. Thinner. Hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that made the angles of her face look severe. But her eyes, dark, steady, unshakable, those hadn't changed. She was holding 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee, the kind that came from ancient vending machines and tasted like regret. She saw him, stopped walking. Her expression didn't shift to surprise. It didn't shift to anything. She just looked at him the way you'd look at a bill that finally came due. "You," she said. One word. Flat. certain, not a question. Dustin tried to say her name, tried to say anything, but his brain couldn't connect the woman in front of him. This woman with tired eyes and worn shoes and hands that shook slightly as she held those coffee cups, to the memory he'd buried. The young woman who used to clean his apartment. The one who'd folded his shirts with care. The one who'd listened when no one else did. The one who'd asked him what he wanted, not what he was supposed to want. The one whose name he'd forgotten for years. Judith. It crashed back now. All of it. The late nights, the wine, the conversations that peeled him open in ways board meetings never could. The loneliness that made them both careless. "Judith," he whispered. "Don't," she said. Her voice was low, controlled. The kind of control that came from practice. "Not here." The doctor cleared her throat. I'm sorry, I'm confused. Do you know each other?" Judith didn't look away from Dustin. "We did, a long time ago." "And these boys, Albert and Richard, they're biologically his," Judith said. The word landed like glass shattering, practically mine. Dustin felt something crack inside his chest. The sick boy, Albert, was still staring at him. The other one, Richard, had turned away, facing the vending machine like he couldn't stand to look. But Dustin didn't know it yet. Judith had spent 16 years preparing for this moment, and she remembered everything. "I don't understand," Dustin said. His voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. "I didn't know. You never—" "I tried," Judith said. She set the coffee cups down on the nearest chair, slowly, deliberately, giving herself time, maybe, or giving him a chance to run. "I called. I texted. I showed up." "When? Does it matter?" "Yes." Judith's jaw tightened. "The night before your company went public. You said you were busy?" Dustin's mind scrambled backward. 16 years ago. The IPO. The worst, best, most terrifying week of his life. He'd been drowning in meetings, investor calls, legal paperwork. His phone had rung constantly. He'd ignored most of it. He didn't remember her call. He didn't remember any of it. "I didn't know," he said again, weaker this time. "I know," Judith replied, and somehow that was worse than anger. "You were very busy." Albert coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Judith move immediately. She was beside him in 2 steps, hand on his back, murmuring something Dustin couldn't hear. Richard finally turned around, looked at Dustin dead on. "You're supposed to save him," he said. "That's why you're here, right? The bone marrow thing." Dustin nodded. "Then do it," Richard said. "And then leave." "Richard," Judith said quietly. "What? That's what he's good at, isn't it?" Richard's voice cracked. "Showing up when it's convenient. Leaving when it's not." Dustin wanted to argue, wanted to explain, wanted to say he didn't know. He would have come. He would have done something. But Albert was looking at him now. Really looking. And Dustin saw something in that boy's face that made words die in his throat. Recognition. "I remember you," Albert said. His voice was soft, tired, but clear. Dustin blinked. "What?" "You used to come to our apartment. You smelled like cedar. You wore a silver watch." Albert paused, coughed again. "You sat on the edge of the couch like you didn't want to stay long." Dustin's chest tightened. He had no memory of this, no memory of an apartment or a couch or these boys as children. "You're wrong," Dustin said. "I've never—" "You touched Mom's face," Albert continued, like Dustin hadn't spoken, like she mattered. "Then you stopped coming." Dustin looked at Judith. She wasn't crying, wasn't angry, just watching, waiting to see what he'd say. But Dustin didn't know what to say, because the truth was worse than abandonment. The truth was erasure. "I need to ask you something," the doctor said, cutting through the silence. She looked uncomfortable, like she'd walked into a family argument she didn't understand. "Mr. Tanner," The consent forms require us to confirm. Do you have any biological relationship to the patient? Dustin swallowed, looked at Albert, at Richard, at Judith. Yes, he said. The doctor made a note. And you're willing to proceed with the donation? Yes. Good. We'll need to schedule additional testing, and I'll have someone from the transplant team come speak with you about... Wait, Judith said. She stepped forward, stopped 3 feet from Dustin, close enough that he could see the faint scar above her left eyebrow, close enough that he could see how much older she looked, how much harder. You don't remember me, she said. It wasn't a question. I do, Dustin said. I remember. You remember a woman who cleaned your apartment. You don't remember what happened after. I remember you left. Judith smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. No, Dustin. I didn't leave. You had me removed. Dustin froze. What? I didn't keep them from you because I wanted to, Judith said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking now. I kept them from you because I couldn't get back. And I couldn't get back because your company signed the papers that had me deported. The hallway tilted. No, Dustin said. That's not... I would never... You did, Judith said. August 12th, 6 years ago. The boys were 5 years old. It was their birthday. And for the first time in 38 years, Dustin Tanner felt something inside him fracture. Because he knew that date. He knew exactly what he'd signed that day. And he knew exactly what he'd done. The hospital cafeteria smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. Dustin sat across from Judith at a corner table, as far from other people as they could get. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone's phone kept ringing 3 tables over. Nobody answered it. Judith's hands were wrapped around a paper cup. She wasn't drinking, just holding it like she needed something to grip. I didn't know, Dustin said. His voice came out hoarse. About the boys. You never told me. Judith's eyes flicked up. I tried. When? The night before your company went public. I called. You said you were busy. I texted. You said we'd talk later. I showed up at your office. She said it like she was reciting a grocery list. No emotion, just facts. Dustin's memory scattered backward, trying to find her in the chaos of that week. He couldn't. I don't remember, he admitted. I know, Judith said. And that was somehow worse than anger. 7 years ago, Judith had been 22 years old and invisible. She worked for a subcontracted cleaning service that serviced luxury apartments in downtown Austin. The kind of apartments where nobody looked at the people who cleaned them. She preferred it that way. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant nobody asked questions about paperwork she didn't have. Dustin's penthouse was on her rotation every Tuesday and Friday evening. 43rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture that looked expensive because it was. The kind of cold, empty space that felt more like a showroom than a home. He was always there when she arrived, working. Laptop open on the marble kitchen island, papers spread everywhere, phone pressed to his ear. He never looked up, never said hello. She'd key in with the service code, clean around him like he was furniture, and leave. For 3 months, he didn't speak to her once. Then one Friday night in September, she arrived, and he was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. No laptop, no phone. Just sitting there in the dark. Judith hesitated at the door. I can come back, she said quietly. He looked up, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. No, he said. It's fine. I just... He stopped, rubbed his face. Do you ever feel like you're making decisions that are technically right but feel completely wrong? Judith set down her cleaning caddy. What kind of decisions? My board wants to cut benefits for hourly workers. Health insurance, mostly. The numbers make sense. Profit margins, shareholder value, all of it. But, he stopped again. But people will suffer, Judith finished. Yeah. She walked over, stood a respectful distance away. You're asking the wrong person, she said. I'm the worker, who'd lose benefits. Dustin blinked. You don't get health insurance? Not from your company, not from anyone. She said it simply, not asking for pity, just stating fact. He stared at her, and something in his face shifted. After that, he started talking to her. Not about work, usually. About pressure, about legacy, about his father, who'd built the company from nothing and expected Dustin to make it invincible. About board members, who treated him like a child, playing dress-up in his father's suit. Judith listened. She didn't offer advice, didn't try to fix him. Just listen the way people do when they understand that sometimes being heard is enough. And she asked questions nobody else asked. What do you want? She said one night while folding his shirts. She had a specific way of doing it, precise, careful, like each fold mattered. Not your father, not your board. You. Dustin had stared at her for a long moment. I don't know, he said finally. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. The scent of lemon cleaner became comforting to him. The sound of her humming while she worked, something soft and wordless, became the only noise in his apartment that didn't feel like pressure. She never diminished herself around him, never made herself smaller to make him feel bigger. She just existed, fully, unapologetically. And Dustin, who'd spent his entire life performing, felt seen for the first time in years. 3 months later, late on a Thursday night, everything changed. They were both exhausted. Judith had worked a double shift. Dustin had been in meetings for 11 straight hours. She'd arrived at his apartment at 10 p.m. to find him staring at a bottle of wine he'd apparently forgotten how to open. Here, she said, taking it from him. He poured 2 glasses, offered her one. She should have said no, should have left, should have remembered the distance that kept her safe. But loneliness has a way of making people careless. They sat on his couch, drank cheap wine out of expensive glasses, and talked with the kind of honesty that only exhaustion allows. Judith told him things she'd never said out loud. How she'd come to the U.S. at 19 because her mother was sick and American dollars went further. How she'd overstayed her visa because going back meant watching her mother die in a system that had already failed her. How she sent money every month and lived on what was left. How she'd perfected the art of being invisible. Dustin told her he felt like an imposter, that he was terrified of disappointing his father, that every decision he made felt like walking through a minefield where one wrong step would prove everyone right. He wasn't good enough, smart enough, strong enough to carry the family name. Somewhere around midnight, the conversation stopped being words and started being something else. Judith didn't remember who moved first, just that they did, and that the loneliness that had been eating them both finally found someone else who understood. But what Dustin didn't know, what Judith hadn't told him because she didn't know yet herself, would become the secret that destroyed them both. I tried to tell you, Judith said now, her voice pulling Dustin back to the hospital cafeteria, back to the fluorescent lights and burnt coffee and 16 years of damage between them. I believe you, Dustin said. Do you? Judith stood, picked up her untouched coffee. They were wearing birthday hats when ice came, 5 years old. Albert asked me where we were going. Richard cried so hard he threw up. Dustin's throat closed. If you've ever watched someone lose everything while trying to explain it to a child, you know there are no words, only the weight, If this story is landing somewhere deep, subscribe, because these untold truths deserve witnesses. Judith turned to leave, stopped, looked back at him one more time. I showed up at your office, she said. I waited in the lobby for 3 hours. You walked past me. You saw me. You nodded and said, "Later?" And you kept walking. Judith! And what happened at that office would explain everything. The silence, the separation, the 16 years of nothing. She walked away. Didn't look back again. Dustin sat frozen. Memory was surfacing now. Not the good parts, the other parts. The parts he'd buried under efficiency and progress and shareholder value. Compliance documents, stacks of them. An automated system his legal team had pitched as liability management. Software that flagged visa violations, generated removal requests, streamlined the process. He'd signed the authorization, never read the individual names, never asked who they were. Just trusted the system, trusted that efficiency was the same as ethics. His signature, at the bottom of hundreds of forms, authorization granted, remove, process, deport, clean, efficient, necessary. Oh God, he whispered to the empty table. What did I do? And somewhere 3 floors above him, his sons, the boys he'd never met, the boys he'd destroyed twice, waited to see if their father would save one of them. Or if he'd disappear again. 6 years ago, Judith Baker stood in the cramped bathroom of her studio apartment and stared at 3 positive pregnancy tests lined up on the edge of the sink. First test, 2 pink lines. Second test, 2 pink lines. Third test, the expensive digital one she'd spent $18 on, flashed the word pregnant in letters that felt like an accusation. Her first thought wasn't joy, it was terror. Her second thought was Dustin. And her third thought, the one that made her sit down on the closed toilet lid with her head between her knees, was that she loved him. Complicated, messy, impossible, but real. She loved the way he listened like her words mattered. The way he looked at her like she wasn't invisible. The way he'd held her that night and whispered that he didn't want her to leave. She loved him. And she had no idea how to tell him she was carrying his child. 2 weeks later, an ultrasound confirmed what she'd already suspected from how violently sick she'd been every morning. Twins. The technician had smiled. "Double blessing," she'd said. Judith had nodded, hadn't corrected her, hadn't said that blessings required documentation she didn't have, and a father who'd already started pulling away. She called Dustin that night. He answered on the 4th ring, distracted, papers rustling in the background. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of..." "It's important. Everything's important right now, Judith. The IPO is in 3 days. I'm drowning here." "Dustin, I'll call you after. I promise." He hung up before she could say the words. She texted him, "Please, I need to see you." His response came 6 hours later. Swamped. Talk later. So she went to his office. The Tanner Logistics building was downtown, all glass and steel, and the kind of architectural confidence that came from generational wealth. Judith had never been inside, had only cleaned Dustin's apartment, never entered his professional world. The lobby was marble, white marble with gray veins running through it like scars. Her shoes, worn sneakers, the only comfortable ones she owned, squeaked against it. The security guard looked up from his desk, looked her up and down, made a decision about who she was and why she was there. "Can I help you?" he asked. The tone suggested he didn't actually want to help. "I'm here to see Dustin Tanner." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but if you could just..." "No appointment, no access." He was already looking back at his computer screen. "Please, it's personal. If you could just call up and tell him Judith is here?" "Ma'am, Mr. Tanner is in back-to-back meetings all day. If you'd like to schedule an appointment, you can call the main number." Judith's hand moved to her stomach, a habit she'd developed in the past 2 weeks. Protective, unconscious. "I'll wait," she said. The guard shrugged. "Suit yourself." She sat in one of the leather chairs near the window, watched people come and go. Executives in suits, assistants carrying tablets, delivery people who got waved through without question because they had badges. She wasn't on the approved visitor list. She understood that now. 3 hours passed. Her back ached. Her feet throbbed. The babies, pressed against her bladder with what felt like personal vendetta. And then the elevator doors opened, and Dustin walked out. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by men in suits, investors maybe, or lawyers. Cameras flashed. A woman with a microphone asked questions Judith couldn't hear from across the lobby. Dustin was smiling, the professional smile he wore like armor. Judith stood, raised her hand slightly, tried to catch his eye, and she did. He saw her. She watched his expression shift, recognition, confusion, then something that looked like panic. His eyes flicked to the crowd around him, to the cameras, back to her. He mouthed one word, "Later," and kept walking. Judith stood there in the marble lobby, security guard watching her with barely concealed suspicion, her hand on her stomach where 2 lives were growing, and understood with perfect clarity that later meant never. 1 year later, in a Texas public hospital during an August heat wave that made the news, Judith gave birth alone. The power had gone out at 11 p.m. Emergency generators kicked in, but the air conditioning didn't. The fans didn't work. The hospital became a sauna with fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Judith labored for 11 hours in a room that felt like it was 100 degrees. Sweat soaked through the hospital gown. Her hair stuck to her face. The nurse kept apologizing, kept bringing ice chips that melted before Judith could swallow them. At 3:17 a.m., Albert was born, screaming, strong, lungs that worked perfectly despite everything. At 3:22 a.m., Richard followed, quiet, watching, eyes open immediately, like he was taking inventory of this world he'd just entered. The nurse smiled, exhausted. 2 healthy boys. You did good, Mama. Then came the paperwork. Name, date of birth, mother's information. Father's name for the birth certificate? The nurse asked, pen poised. Judith looked at her sons, both of them perfect. Both of them American citizens, by the simple fact of being born on this soil. Leave it blank, she said. She told herself Dustin would come around eventually, that when he saw them, he'd understand. She was wrong, but not for the reason she thought. For 5 years, Judith raised them alone. She worked 3 jobs. Breakfast shift at a diner. Afternoon cleaning route. Night shifts at a laundromat where she could bring the boys and they'd sleep on folded towels in the back room while she worked. She sent photos to Dustin's email. Albert's first smile. Richard's first steps. Their first day of preschool. No response. She left voicemails. They're walking now. They ask about you. They're beautiful, Dustin. They're so beautiful. No response. After 2 years, she stopped trying. He'd made his choice, and Judith was done begging. She poured everything into those boys. Read to them every night, even when she was so tired the words blurred. Made birthday cakes from scratch because store-bought felt like giving up. Taught them to be kind, to be strong, to understand that sometimes people leave and it's not your fault. On their 5th birthday, she made paper party hats, cut them from construction paper, and decorated them with markers she'd gotten from the dollar store. Albert wanted stars. Richard wanted stripes. She made chocolate cake, the boys' favorite. A splurge, but birthdays mattered. They were eating breakfast, pancakes, another splurge, when the knock came. 9:47 a.m. Judith would remember that time for the rest of her life. The knock was so loud it shook the door. "Judith Baker?" She knew immediately. The way a deer knows when the hunter's in the woods. Instinct. Terror. She dropped to her knees and pulled both boys into her arms. Albert's paper crown crumpled against her chest. Richard started crying. "Mommy," Albert whispered. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." The ICE officer stood in her doorway. Professional, efficient, just doing his job. Neighbors appeared in doorways, watching. Some looked sympathetic. Some looked like they'd expected this. "They're American citizens," Judith said. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't let it. "They were born here." "We know, ma'am, but you weren't." Richard screamed when they took her. Albert went silent, which was somehow worse. 72 hours later, Judith stood in a processing facility and signed papers she didn't fully understand. "Emergency foster placement," they said. "Temporary," they said. "You'll be able to come back for them," they said. All lies. The last time she saw her sons, they were behind a glass partition, both of them crying, hands pressed to the glass like they could push through it if they just tried hard enough. "I'll come back," Judith whispered. "I promise." But what Judith didn't know, what she wouldn't discover for 3 more years, was that her deportation wasn't random, and the man responsible was the same man who'd left her voicemails unanswered. Dustin left the hospital at 1:47 a.m. Didn't tell anyone he was leaving, just walked out through the emergency exit and got in his car. His hands shook on the steering wheel. He drove to his office on autopilot, muscle memory taking him through streets he didn't see, past buildings that might as well have been empty. The Tanner Logistics headquarters was dark except for security lights. The guard at the desk looked surprised to see him. "Mr. Tanner, everything all right?" "Fine," Dustin lied. "Forgot something in my office." He took the elevator to the 42nd floor. His office was at the end of the hall, corner view, the kind of space that cost more per month than most people made in a year. He'd stopped noticing that a long time ago. The archived files were in the storage room adjacent to his office. Digital copies existed somewhere on a server, but Dustin needed the physical ones. Needed to see his signature with his own eyes. He found the boxes labeled Compliance 2019 and pulled them down. Dust rose in the air, visible in the overhead lights. The cardboard was heavier than he remembered. Tanner Logistics, Workplace Compliance Initiative. His company's name, his father's name, his name. Inside were hundreds of pages. Names, addresses, employment verification requests, visa status reports, removal authorizations. His signature at the bottom of every authorization form. Now pay close attention to what happens when he reads the date. Page 47, Judith Maria Baker, address in Austin. Employment status, subcontracted cleaning services. Visa status, overstayed tourist visa, 6 years. Children, 2 minors, U.S. citizens. The date at the top of the form, August 12th. Dustin's vision blurred. He opened his laptop with shaking hands and pulled up his calendar from 6 years ago. The entries loaded slowly, each one a small knife. August 12th, 6 years ago. 7 a.m. Review compliance authorizations. 8 a.m. Board meeting 10 a.m. Press conference, IPO announcement. 12 p.m. Lunch with investors. 3 p.m. Market opening celebration. 6 p.m. Champagne reception. He'd signed the authorization that morning, between coffee and his first meeting. Probably while checking his phone. Probably while thinking about stock prices and shareholder value, and everything except the names on the pages. Never read them. Never asked who they were. Never wondered if those names belonged to people whose lives he was about to destroy. Just trusted the system. Trusted that efficiency was the same as ethics. His coffee sat on the desk, forgotten, going cold. The hum of his empty office felt deafening. The weight of the paper in his hands felt like it could pull him through the floor. He'd signed Judith's deportation order on the same day he'd celebrated becoming a billionaire. 6 months earlier, in this same building, Dustin had sat at a conference table and made the decision that would destroy everything. We need to eliminate legal liability. His CFO had said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing printer paper costs. The consultant they'd hired was sharp. Expensive suit, leather portfolio, the kind of confidence that came from selling the same pitch to a dozen companies. Automated compliance verification, the consultant said, pulling up a PowerPoint. We flag workers without proper documentation, generate removal requests through our ICE partnership, and eliminate your exposure to federal penalties. Dustin had hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. Not illegal. The lawyers had been very clear that it was legal, but wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. This feels like we're turning people in, he said. You're complying with federal law, the consultant corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Dustin looked around the table. Board members, lawyers, his CFO who'd been with the company since his father ran it. It's just paperwork, the CFO said. We're not ICE. We're just complying, doing our due diligence, protecting the company your father built. And there it was. The magic words. Your father. The legacy. The responsibility. The weight Dustin had carried since the day his father handed him the keys and said, "Don't screw this up." Dustin signed the contract. Air-conditioned boardroom. Catered lunch. Italian, he thought. Or maybe Japanese. He couldn't remember. That choice, made in comfort, made in ignorance, made because it was easier than asking hard questions, would destroy 3 lives. 4, if you count his own. Now, alone in his office at 2 a.m., Dustin closed the file, sat in darkness. Let the weight of what he'd done crush him the way it should have 6 years ago. Some of you watching this have lived through betrayal that came with paperwork and signatures. The kind that looked legal, but felt like murder. If you're still here, you understand why these stories matter. Hit, like, if you believe, accountability should have no statute of limitations. 3 floors above Dustin's empty office, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and worry, Albert was awake. Richard sat in the chair beside his bed, reading aloud from a book Albert had stopped caring about an hour ago. But Richard kept reading anyway, because stopping meant talking about things neither of them knew how to say. "Do you remember him?" Albert asked suddenly. "The tall man?" Richard stopped mid-sentence. "No." "Liar. You remember everything." "Then why are you asking?" "Because I want to know if you hate him as much as I do." Richard closed the book, set it carefully on the side table. "I don't remember him," he said again. But his voice was different now, quieter. "I remember the knock. I remember Mom crying. I remember foster care and group homes and wondering why nobody wanted us. Mom wanted us. She couldn't get back to us. There's a difference." Albert turned his head to look at his brother. "He's going to donate the bone marrow. The doctor said so." "Yeah? And then what? He saves me and disappears again?" "Probably." "Good," Albert said, but his voice cracked. "I don't want a father who only shows up when there's something to save." Richard didn't answer, just picked up the book again and pretended to read. The boys had spent 11 years wondering why their father never came. They were about to learn the answer was worse than abandonment. At 3:15 a.m., Dustin returned to the hospital. Found Judith in the chapel. She was sitting in the back row, hands folded in her lap, not praying, just sitting, looking at the plain wooden cross on the wall like it might have answers. Dustin sat down behind her, didn't approach, didn't touch her shoulder or try to make her look at him. "I found the paperwork," he whispered, I signed it. I didn't know it was you, but that doesn't matter. I still signed it." Judith didn't turn around, didn't move. The silence stretched so long, Dustin wondered if she'd heard him. Then she spoke. 2 words. "I know." Simple, devastating, final. And what Judith would ask him next would force Dustin to choose between his empire and his son's. When Judith Baker arrived in Mexico City 6 years ago, she landed in a country that felt more foreign than the one she'd just been forced to leave. She hadn't been there since she was 8 years old. Her mother had brought her to Texas for what was supposed to be a temporary visit. They never left. And when her mother died, 2 years before the boys were born, Judith lost the only person who remembered Mexico as home. The airport was chaos. Announcements in Spanish that she barely understood anymore. People rushing past her like she was a stone in a river. She had one bag, $43. 2 photos of her sons tucked into her wallet. No family, no connections, no job, no plan, except the only one that mattered. Survive long enough to get back to Albert and Richard. She found a room in a boarding house in a neighborhood where Americans didn't go. $12 a night for a space barely bigger than a closet. The mattress smelled like cigarettes and mildew. The window didn't close all the way. Traffic noise poured in 24 hours a day. Horns, engines, voices shouting in a language she'd forgotten how to speak fluently. At night she lay awake and counted ceiling tiles. 72 of them. Some cracked, some stained. All of them proof she was still alive, still breathing, still one day closer to finding a way home. Within a week, she found work at a call center that serviced American customers. Her English was her only advantage. She took the night shift because it paid more. 8 hours of people yelling at her about bills they didn't want to pay, services they didn't receive, problems she had no power to solve. She saved every peso. After 6 months, she had enough to hire an immigration lawyer. The consultation cost everything she'd saved. The lawyer was blunt, professional in the way doctors are when they deliver bad news they've delivered 100 times before. 10-year ban, he said, reading from her file. Possibly permanent. You were flagged as priority removal. That means someone specifically requested expedited deportation. I have 2 American sons, Judith said. They're 5 years old. They're in foster care. The lawyer looked up. Something in his face softened. I'm sorry, but even with citizen children, the appeal process takes years. And with a priority flag, he paused, they'll be adults before you can return legally. Judith heard the words, understood them, refused to accept them. She walked out of that office and kept walking until her feet blistered. The city blurred around her. Traffic sounds, street vendors, the smell of exhaust and cooking meat, and her own sweat. The weight of impossibility pressed down on her shoulders like something physical. But she didn't stop moving, because stopping meant accepting that Albert and Richard would grow up without her, and Judith would die before she accepted that. Maria found her 8 months later. Maria worked at a legal aid clinic that specialized in deportation cases. She was younger than Judith, sharper, angrier in the way people are when they've seen too many families destroyed by paperwork. I'm taking your case, Maria said, not asking, telling. I can't pay you. I'm not asking you to. Your sons are U.S. citizens. You were deported without proper due process. That's grounds for appeal. It took 3 years. 3 years of paperwork and hearings and appeals that went nowhere. 3 years of Judith working double shifts so she could afford the fees Maria's clinic couldn't cover. 3 years of birthday cards she couldn't send. Phone calls to foster services that wouldn't tell her where her sons were placed. 3 years of photographs she carried everywhere. Albert and Richard, at 3, at 4, At 5, in their homemade birthday crowns. Maria became the only anchor Judith had. The only person who understood that this wasn't about immigration policy or legal precedent. This was about 2 boys who needed their mother and a mother who was clawing through concrete to reach them. Year 4, Maria found something. She came to Judith's apartment. A better one now, still small but with a window that closed, carrying a file folder and an expression Judith couldn't read. "Your deportation was expedited removal," Maria said, sitting down at Judith's small kitchen table. "Someone flagged you as priority. That's unusual for someone with your profile. So I dug deeper." She opened the folder, pulled out a document with official letterhead. "Your removal was authorized under a corporate compliance partnership. The request came through an organization called Tanner Logistics Foundation." Judith's face went white. The room tilted. "Do you know this company?" Maria asked. Judith couldn't speak, could only nod. She knew exactly who owned it, knew exactly whose name was on the building, knew exactly whose signature was probably on the authorization form. That's when Judith understood. Dustin hadn't just ignored her. He'd erased her. Now, in the chapel at 3:47 a.m., Judith finally turned to face him. Dustin looked smaller somehow, older. The confidence she remembered, the boardroom armor, was gone. He looked like a man who'd been hollowed out. "You want absolution?" she said. "I don't have any to give." "I want to help," Dustin said. "The boys, whatever they need. They need a father. They needed one 16 years ago. I can't undo that." "No," Judith said. "You can't." The chapel door opened. A doctor, not the one from earlier, someone new, stepped inside, looked between them. "I'm sorry to interrupt. We need Mr. Tanner immediately. Albert's condition is deteriorating." Judith was on her feet before the sentence ended. "What happened?" Her voice was steady. Years of practice keeping terror locked behind her teeth. "His body's starting to reject the preliminary medications. We need to move up the transplant timeline. We need a donor within 48 hours. Dustin stood. "Test me now." "Mr. Tanner, the process takes—" "Test me now," he repeated. "Whatever you need. Take it." Judith looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw the desperation there, the guilt. The man who'd finally woken up 16 years too late. "And then what?" she asked. "You save him and disappear again?" "I'm not going anywhere." "Prove it." The doctor cleared his throat. "We need to move. Now." Judith walked toward the door. Dustin followed several steps behind, like he understood he'd lost the right to walk beside her. They moved through hallways that smelled like floor cleaner and fear. Judith's shoes squeaked on linoleum. Dustin's breathing was too loud. At the elevator, Judith pressed the button for the pediatric floor. The doors opened. Albert and Richard were in the hallway outside Albert's room. Richard's arm was around his brother's shoulders. Albert looked pale, unsteady, but upright. When they saw Judith, both boys moved toward her. Albert reached for her hand. Richard leaned into her shoulder, automatic, unconscious. 16 years of muscle memory that said safe, safe, safe. Dustin stood in the elevator and watched. Saw 16 years of love he wasn't part of. 16 years of sick days and skinned knees and nightmares and homework and inside jokes and the 1,000 tiny moments that made a family. Saw what he destroyed with his signature on a document he never read. Saw what he'd spent his whole life building, empire, legacy, success, and understood with perfect clarity that none of it mattered compared to what Judith had built from ash. The donation testing took 6 hours. Blood work, tissue typing, medical history that Dustin had never thought about before. The technician asked questions about his family's health patterns, and Dustin realized he knew more about quarterly earnings than he did about his own DNA. But the results came back exactly as expected. Perfect match. Compatible on every marker that mattered. Biology didn't care about 16 years of absence. Cells recognized each other even when people didn't. Surgery was scheduled for 36 hours out. Wednesday morning at 6 a.m., Albert would be prepped starting Tuesday night. The hospital administrator, a woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes, suggested what she probably thought was a good idea. Before we proceed, would you like a family meeting to discuss expectations, answer questions, help everyone feel prepared? Judith looked at Dustin. Dustin looked at the floor. Yes, Judith said. They gathered in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. Beige walls, plastic chairs, a table with fake wood veneer, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. The room smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner. 4 of them. Judith sat beside her sons. Dustin sat across from them, an ocean of 3 feet that might as well have been miles. Albert looked pale, but steady. The oxygen tube was gone, but his breathing still seemed labored. Richard sat rigid, arms crossed, jaw set like he was preparing for battle. The administrator started to speak, something about recovery timelines and post-surgical care. But Albert interrupted. "I remember you," he said, looking directly at Dustin. The administrator stopped mid-sentence. Dustin blinked. "You do? You used to sit on our couch. You smelled like cedar. You had a silver watch, silver band, black face. You checked it constantly, like you were always running out of time." Albert's voice was quiet but certain. "You touched Mom's face like she was important." The specificity of it hit Dustin like a physical blow. He had no memory of this. No memory of a couch, or twins young enough to notice what he smelled like, or touching Judith's face. "Then you stopped coming," Albert finished. Long pause. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's phone buzzed in the hallway outside. "I didn't know you existed," Dustin said. "I swear I didn't know." "You knew something," Albert said. "You just decided it didn't matter enough to find out what." Here's where it gets important. Pay attention to what Richard says next. Richard had been silent, staring at his hands, knuckles white from how hard he was gripping his own arms. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet, they all had to lean forward to hear. "I remember the knock." Dustin looked at him. "What knock?" "The morning they took her. It was my birthday. We were eating pancakes. Albert was wearing a paper crown, red construction paper, with gold stars Mom drew with a marker." Richard's voice started to crack, but he pushed through. "The knock was so loud it shook the door. I thought maybe it was a delivery. Maybe a birthday present." Judith's hand moved to cover her mouth. "Mom dropped the spatula," Richard continued. "I remember the sound it made hitting the floor, metal on linoleum. I remember her face. She looked like someone died." He finally looked up at Dustin. "I was 5 years old, and I knew, just knew, that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to take her away from us." His voice broke completely on the last word. Tears he'd been holding for 11 years finally spilled over. Judith reached for him. Richard let her, buried his face in her shoulder, the way he'd probably done 1,000 times when the world became too much. Dustin watched, saw the boy who'd pretended not to remember, saw the pain he'd been carrying, saw what happens when children have to grow up understanding that the people who should protect them can also destroy them. Albert was still looking at Dustin, waiting. "Did you know?" Albert asked. "About the deportation?" "No. I swear I didn't know it was your mother." "Not that." Albert's interruption was sharp. "Did you know about us? That we existed?" Dustin swallowed. "No. Your mother tried to tell me. I didn't listen." "Why not?" Because I was building something I thought mattered more. Did it? Albert asked. Did whatever you were building matter more than us? Dustin looked at Judith, at the woman who'd survived 6 years of impossible separation. Looked at the boys, 16 years old now, nearly men, raised without him. Looked at the 16 years of birthdays and first days of school, and scraped knees and bad dreams, and triumph and failure, and every tiny moment that built a life. No, he said. Simple. Final. The only truth that mattered. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. The administrator rattled off instructions that no one really heard. Albert needed rest. Surgery prep would begin tomorrow evening. Questions could be directed to the nursing staff. The boys left with Judith. Albert leaned on his mother. Richard walked close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. They moved as a unit, practiced, automatic, the choreography of a family that had learned to function without extra members. Dustin sat alone in the conference room after they left. There's a generation of women who raise children alone while the fathers built empires. If you're one of them, or if you were one of those children, share this. Someone in your life needs to know their story isn't invisible. That night, back in his empty penthouse, Dustin couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., he opened his laptop and typed Judith Baker into Google. Nothing came up. Or rather, nothing that was her. A few social media profiles belonging to different people. An obituary for someone in Ohio. A LinkedIn for a woman in marketing. Judith had lived invisibly, on purpose. The way people do when visibility means danger. He tried the boys' names next. Albert Baker. Richard Baker. This time, results appeared. School honor roll from Austin High School. Albert Baker, straight A's, sophomore year. Richard Baker, debate team captain, regional finalist. A local news article about a charity soccer match. Albert Baker scored the winning goal. Raised $3,000 for homeless youth services. A photograph from a scholarship awards ceremony. Richard Baker, first place in state policy debate competition. Fragment by fragment, Dustin saw their lives. Saw Albert's athletic awards and Richard's academic achievements, and the boys they'd become without him. Good men, strong men, men who worked hard and cared about people and stood up for things that mattered. Men Judith had raised alone, while Dustin built an empire that meant nothing. He looked at the photos, saw himself in their faces, saw Judith in their character, understood with devastating clarity that they didn't need him to become who they were. They'd become it in spite of him. Judith did that, alone, while working 3 jobs and fighting deportation orders, and never once poisoning them against the father who'd abandoned them. Dustin closed his laptop, sat in his 43rd floor penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of a city he'd conquered, sat surrounded by everything he'd built, and felt emptier than he'd ever felt in his life. Wednesday morning, 6 a.m. Albert was wheeled into surgery. Dustin was already in pre-op for the bone marrow extraction. They'd explained the procedure. Needle into the hip bone, extract marrow directly from the source. He'd be under general anesthesia, wouldn't feel anything. The pain came after. Dustin woke up in recovery, with his hip screaming, and a nurse checking his vitals. "You did great, Mr. Tanner. The donation was successful. They're transplanting it into your son now." Your son. The words sounded foreign, true but unearned. 24 hours. That's how long they had to wait for initial signs that Albert's body would accept the donor cells. 24 hours to see if the transplant would take, or if Albert's immune system would reject the one thing trying to save him. Judith and Dustin sat in the same waiting room, different corners, silent. The television played morning news on mute. Other families came and went. A woman brought coffee. Neither of them drank. Hour 17, Judith spoke. If you want to be part of their lives, you do it my way. Dustin looked up. She was staring straight ahead, not at him. Anything, he said. You tell the truth. Publicly. What truth? All of it. The deportation system. Your company's role. My name. Their names. What you did. Dustin's chest tightened. That'll destroy my company. Judith finally looked at him. Yes. And here's the thing. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for accountability. Hour 23, the doctors confirmed Albert's body was accepting the transplant. Early signs were positive. He'd need monitoring, medication, months of recovery. But he was going to live. Richard cried. Judith held both boys and let herself break for the first time since they'd walked into this hospital. Dustin watched from the doorway and understood he had no right to join them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. 2 days later, Dustin's legal team arrived at his penthouse. 3 lawyers, 2 advisors, his CFO. They spread documents across his dining table, like battle plans. Donate anonymously, the lead counsel said. We'll structure it through a shell foundation. Private settlement with the family. Standard NDA. You never admit corporate involvement. What if I testify publicly? Dustin asked. The room went silent. About what? The CFO finally said. The compliance system, the deportations, everything. His lead counsel, a woman who'd been with the company for 12 years, set down her pen. That would be career suicide, stockholder lawsuits, possible criminal liability for immigration violations. The board would remove you immediately. But it's the truth. Truth is expensive, Dustin. He looked at the documents. The exit strategy they'd built. Clean, efficient, protected. Everything his father had taught him to value. Then he thought about Albert's question, the one that had been echoing in his head for 3 days. Albert had asked it in the hospital room that morning, weak but recovering, Richard reading beside him. Dustin had come to check on him. Albert had looked at him with those gray-green eyes, Dustin's eyes, and said, Would you still help us if no one was watching? What? Dustin had asked. If there were no cameras, no public credit, if we could never tell anyone you saved me, would you still do it? Yes. Albert had studied him. Measuring truth against lies he'd probably heard before. Then prove it. Do the thing that costs you everything. Now, looking at his legal team's carefully constructed escape plan, Dustin understood what Albert meant. Schedule a press conference, he said. Dustin. And contact the Congressional Committee investigating corporate immigration practices. Tell them I want to testify. The lawyers looked at each other. The CFO started to argue. Dustin held up his hand. It's already decided. 1 week later, Dustin Tanner sat before a congressional panel and destroyed everything his father had built. The hearing room was packed. Cameras everywhere. C-SPAN broadcasting live. Reporters from every major outlet. Congressional representatives in 2 rows. Elevated, looking down at him like judges. Dustin's hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. Camera flashes created spots in his vision. The air conditioning was too cold, but sweat ran down his back anyway. In the gallery, 3 rows back, Judith sat between Albert and Richard. Albert was thin, still recovering, but alive. Richard sat rigid, watching. Judith's face was unreadable. Dustin began. My name is Dustin Tanner. I was CEO of Tanner Logistics. 6 years ago, my company partnered with Immigration and Customs Enforcement to create an automated deportation pipeline. The room shifted. Reporters started typing. Congressional members leaned forward. We called it workforce compliance verification. What it actually did was flag undocumented workers, generate removal requests, and streamline deportations. I authorized this system. I signed the contract. I never reviewed individual cases. Never asked who these people were, never considered that names on paper were lives that would be destroyed. His voice cracked. He pushed through. One of those names was Judith Baker, mother of my children. She was deported on August 12th, 6 years ago. It was my son's 5th birthday. I signed the authorization that morning between emails. I didn't know it was her, but that doesn't matter. I still signed it. Stock prices were crashing in real time. Dustin could see phones lighting up around the room, text messages, emergency calls. His company imploding with every word. I built an empire on efficiency, on profit margins, and shareholder value and quarterly growth. And I did it by turning human beings into data points, by trusting systems instead of asking questions, by choosing comfort over conscience. He looked up at Judith. She wasn't crying, wasn't smiling, just watching, witnessing. I can't undo what I did. I can't give Judith back the 6 years I took. Can't give my sons back the childhood I erased. But I can tell the truth. And I can use what resources I have left to dismantle systems like the one I created. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Questions from every representative. Details about the system, the contracts, the money. Every answer another nail in the coffin of his career. Redemption doesn't erase damage. But witnessing someone take accountability? That's rare enough to matter. Comment below. Do you believe people can earn forgiveness, or are some choices permanent? I want to hear from you. By 6 p.m. that evening, the board had voted. Unanimous. Dustin Tanner was removed as CEO, effective immediately. He walked out of the Tanner Logistics building for the last time at 7:34 p.m. Reporters swarmed, microphones in his face, cameras everywhere, questions shouted from every direction. Mr. Tanner, do you regret your testimony? Will you face criminal charges? What happens to Tanner Logistics now? One question cut through the noise. A young reporter, couldn't have been more than 25. Was it worth it? Dustin stopped, looked across the street. Judith stood there with Albert and Richard. They'd come. He didn't know why. Maybe to watch him fall. Maybe to witness the end of something. Albert raised his hand. A small wave. Tentative. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but acknowledgement. Dustin looked back at the reporter. Yes, he said. Yes, it was. 3 weeks post-transplant, Albert's blood work came back clean. The doctors used words like remarkable and promising and cautiously optimistic. His body was accepting the donor cells. White blood cell count rising steadily. No signs of rejection. No infections. Every day, a small victory that added up to something that looked like survival. Richard never left his side. He slept in the chair beside Albert's bed, neck bent at angles that would hurt later, but didn't matter now. Read to him when Albert was too tired to focus on screens. Made stupid jokes that weren't funny, but made Albert smile anyway. Judith slept in the recliner. Hospital staff offered her a cot in a family room down the hall. She refused. 16 years of distance had taught her. When you get your children back, you don't let them out of your sight. Dustin came every day, sat in the hallway outside Albert's room, never entered unless invited. Brought coffee Judith didn't drink but accepted anyway. The silence between them was full of things neither knew how to say. Week 4, Judith's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Ms. Baker, this is Judge Patricia Ramos from the Immigration Court. I'm calling about your case. Judith's hand tightened on the phone. Richard looked up from his book. Albert shifted in bed, suddenly alert. Dustin Tanner's congressional testimony triggered a federal investigation into corporate immigration compliance programs. Your deportation has been flagged for review. Based on due process violations and the expedited removal irregularities, I'm prepared to issue an immediate ruling. Judith couldn't breathe. Deportation order vacated. Residency granted, effective immediately. You'll receive documentation within 72 hours. The phone slipped from Judith's hand. She caught it, dropped it again. Richard grabbed it, listened, said thank you to the judge because his mother couldn't speak. And for the first time in 6 years, for the first time since they'd taken her sons and put her on a plane to a country that wasn't home, Judith Baker cried. Not from pain, not from grief, from relief, from the weight of impossibility finally lifting, from understanding that her sons would never have to wonder if she'd be taken again. Albert reached for her hand. Richard wrapped his arms around her, and Judith let herself break in the way she'd never allowed herself to break before. Dustin heard from the hallway. Didn't enter, just stood there with his coffee, and understood that this moment, this watershed of relief and victory, belonged to them, not him. 2 days later, Richard found Dustin in the hospital cafeteria. Dustin was staring at a sandwich he hadn't touched. Richard sat down across from him without asking. "You think donating bone marrow makes you a father?" Richard said. No preamble, no softening. Dustin looked up. "No." "You think losing your company makes us even?" "No." "Then what do you want?" Dustin set down the sandwich. "A chance." "To do what?" "To show up every day until you believe me." Richard studied him. 16 years old, but with eyes that had seen too much too young. "What if we never believe you?" "Then I keep showing up anyway." "Why?" "Because it's what I should have done 16 years ago." Richard leaned back, arms crossed, the protective stance he wore like armor. "You know what the worst part was? It wasn't that you were gone. It was not knowing why. Mom never said anything bad about you, never told us you abandoned us. Just said you didn't know how to choose us. And I spent 11 years wondering what was wrong with us that made us so hard to choose." Dustin's throat closed. "Nothing. There was nothing wrong with you." "Then why didn't you try?" "Because I was a coward. Because I convinced myself my company mattered more than uncomfortable questions. Because I failed in every way that mattered. And we're just getting to the good part, the part where they decide if second chances are real." That evening, Judith found Dustin on the hospital roof. The smoking area, though neither of them smoked. They just needed air that didn't smell like antiseptic. The city spread out below them, lights coming on as dusk settled. "I don't forgive you," Judith said, not looking at him, looking at the skyline. "I know, but I don't hate you either." Dustin turned slightly. "What do you feel?" Judith was quiet for a long time. A helicopter passed overhead. Traffic noise rose from the streets below. The wind picked up, cold enough to make her shiver. "Tired," she finally said, "and grateful you saved him, and angry it took this for you to see us, and relieved I can stay, and sad for all the years we lost, and—" She stopped, breathed. "I feel everything and nothing. I feel too much." "I'm sorry," Dustin said, knowing it wasn't enough, knowing it would never be enough. "I know," Judith said, "but sorry doesn't give me back 6 years, doesn't give them back their childhood, doesn't undo the nights they cried for me and I couldn't come. No, it doesn't." They stood in silence. Not comfortable, not companionable. Just two people who destroyed each other, learning how to exist in the same space without combusting. The next morning, Albert was strong enough to walk the hallways. Physical therapy, building strength. His legs shaky but functional. Richard walked beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. Dustin was in his usual spot in the hallway. Albert saw him, stopped. "I have a question." Dustin stood. "Okay. If you could go back, knowing everything, would you still choose your company over us?" I'd choose you every time, but I didn't know you existed. Albert's jaw tightened. You did. Mom told you. You just didn't want to know. Dustin couldn't argue, couldn't defend himself, because Albert was right. Yeah, Dustin said quietly. You're right. Albert nodded, like he'd been testing something and got the answer he expected. That's the part I can't forgive yet. Yet? Dustin heard the word, held on to it like a lifeline. Maybe not ever, Albert said. I don't know. I'm still figuring out if you're actually staying, or if this is just guilt that'll wear off. I'm staying. Prove it, Albert said. Same thing he'd said before. Same challenge. Same test that Dustin would have to pass every single day for the rest of his life. Albert walked away. Richard followed. Neither looked back. Dustin stood alone in the hallway and understood. Forgiveness isn't guaranteed. Some wounds don't close. Some mistakes can't be unmade. But showing up anyway, even when you're not wanted, even when you're not forgiven, even when every day is a reminder of what you destroyed, that's the only option left. And maybe, if he showed up long enough, consistently enough, honestly enough, the word yet might eventually become now. Or maybe it wouldn't. But he'd show up anyway, because that's what fathers do. Even the ones who failed spectacularly at it for 16 years. Even the ones who had to learn the hard way that love isn't about grand gestures or donations or public testimony. It's about showing up every single day. Starting now. 6 months later, Albert ran a full mile without stopping. His doctor cried. Richard filmed it. Judith watched from the bleachers and remembered the hospital room where she'd wondered if she'd ever see her son run again. Albert was back on the soccer team, starting midfielder. His teammates had shaved their heads in solidarity during treatment. Now they all had matching buzz cuts in a championship they'd dedicated to him. Richard was back in school, junior year, nearly senior, debate team captain. He'd won regionals with a speech about immigration policy that made 3 judges cry and 1 walk out. He didn't care. He'd said what needed saying. Judith had received her residency documentation, green card in hand, path to citizenship open. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of all the years she'd spent fighting for it. Dustin moved out of his penthouse, sold it, actually, bought a modest house in the same neighborhood as the boys' school. 3 bedrooms, small yard, garage where the door stuck sometimes. No gates, no security system, no marble floors or floor-to-ceiling windows. Just a house where the heating made strange noises and the kitchen faucet dripped. It was the first place he'd lived that felt like it could be a home. He showed up. Every soccer game, sitting 3 rows back, never in Judith's line of sight, but always there. Every debate tournament, watching Richard dismantle opponents with logic and passion, Dustin recognized from Judith. Every difficult homework night when Albert texted, stuck on calculus, and Dustin drove over with graph paper and patience. The boys never called him Dad. They called him Dustin. Sometimes Mr. Tanner when they were being funny. Mostly just Dustin. And that was enough. It had to be. Because earning the right to something more took time. And time was the only currency Dustin had left to spend. 4 months in, Richard's car broke down. The old Honda Civic Judith had saved 2 years to buy. Richard called Dustin, not a tow service. Dustin arrived 20 minutes later with a toolbox he'd bought specifically for moments like this. Moments he hoped would come. Moments that meant trust was building, slowly, like scar tissue over a wound. He didn't hire a mechanic, didn't solve the problem with money. He lay on the ground next to Richard in a grocery store parking lot and taught him how to identify the issue, how to replace a serpentine belt, how to check fluid levels. Their hands were both covered in grease when Richard asked, "Why are you here?" "Because you called," Dustin said. "I might not call again. I'll still be here." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The belt's backwards. We need to flip it." They fixed it together. Richard drove away 20 minutes later. Didn't say, "Thank you." Didn't need to. The fact that he'd called was thanks enough. Thanksgiving arrived cold and clear. Judith's apartment smelled like roasting turkey, and the pumpkin pie Albert had helped make, slightly lopsided but edible. Richard was arguing with Maria about football versus soccer. Albert was mashing potatoes with the kind of violence only teenage boys can bring to cooking. The doorbell rang at 3 p.m. Judith answered it. Dustin stood there holding flowers, grocery store flowers, nothing expensive, and looking uncertain in a way that made him seem younger. "You said 3 o'clock, he said. "I did," Judith confirmed, took the flowers, stepped aside, and "Come in." First time he'd been invited inside her home. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms that the boys shared, furniture from thrift stores, photographs everywhere, the boys at every age, Judith with Maria, soccer trophies and debate medals, and report cards held up with magnets. A life built from nothing. A life Dustin had nearly destroyed. "You can set the table," Judith said, handing him plates. Dustin set the table. Maria watched him with the protective suspicion of someone who'd fought beside Judith through the worst years. Albert tested him with questions about soccer strategy. Richard stayed quiet but didn't leave the room. They sat down to eat. No grand declarations, no speeches, just presence, just the work of becoming something that might eventually look like family. After dinner, Maria pulled Judith aside while the boys argued about whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie. "He proposed a scholarship fund," Maria whispered, "for children of deported parents, named after you." Judith's hand stilled on the dish towel. "I didn't ask for that." "He's not asking for credit. He's asking permission." Judith looked across the kitchen at Dustin, who was trying to explain to Richard why it absolutely was a Christmas movie. Saw the man who'd destroyed her life trying, desperately, to build something good from the wreckage. Her eyes went wet. Tell him yes. After dinner, Judith stepped onto the apartment balcony. Small enough for 2 people, if they didn't mind being close. City lights spread below them. The air was cold enough to see breath. Dustin followed, stood beside her, not touching, barely close enough to feel the warmth of another person. "They deserved you sooner," Judith said, looking at the skyline. "Not at him. I didn't deserve them until now." Silence. The sound of the boys laughing inside, the distant wail of a siren, the ordinary sounds of life continuing. "Maybe you still don't," Judith said quietly, "but you're trying. That counts for something." Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But acknowledgement. Recognition that showing up, day after day, changed the shape of things. Stories like Judith's don't end with fireworks. They end with a woman standing in her kitchen, finally breathing freely. If you stayed till the end, thank you for bearing witness. Subscribe if you believe every woman's story deserves to be told, especially the ones that don't make headlines. Inside, Albert and Richard were washing dishes, arguing about sports with the kind of comfortable antagonism only brothers have. Richard flicked soap suds at Albert. Albert retaliated with the spray nozzle, both of them laughing. On the balcony, Judith and Dustin stood in silence. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible. "You can stay for coffee," Judith said. "I'd like that," Dustin replied. Not forgiveness, not romance, not the ending anyone would have written if they'd started this story knowing how it would turn out. Just coexistence. just the slow work of becoming people who could stand on the same balcony without combusting. And for the first time in 16 years, that felt like enough. Some mistakes don't disappear when the paper is filed. They grow up. And one day, they look you in the eyes and decide if you've earned the right to stay.